Sachin Nandha ji, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, you have written this book about Shri Hedgewar ji. And I thought that's very intriguing because I have never seen a book about him. I don't really know much about him. And I decided not to read the book until I had this conversation with you. So, first of all, for the uninitiated, who was Dr. Hedgewar? And secondly, after that, what's your background and what brought you to this?
Sure. Yes. No, of course. And look, it's a real delight to be here. Thank you for having me on. And you're right in what you say, by the way, that Keshav Hedgewar, philosophy and influence affects, I would say, 1/5 of humanity, right? All of India, literally corner to corner, north to south, east to west. And yet nobody really knows anything about him, right? He's kind of, he's the founder of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. And the RSS is something that almost everybody seems to have an opinion on, right? But he founded the RSS and nobody knows anything about him, really. Now, there are several reasons for that. Because, firstly, there's very little in English. On him. Very little. There are, you will find the occasional page or a paragraph in the academic literature in this country. You will find, I think, four books in English written by the RSS back in the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
But these are hagiographies. They're very reverential. They're written for a different audience, very much for internal consumption. So it's very different.
Okay.
And of course, they've not been widely circulated. Then in Marathi, there's a very comprehensive biography that a Pracharak in the 60s put together on his life. A man called Nana Palkar, who I use quite extensively to kind of, he's again one of my topographical maps. But again, it was in Marathi, and also it was again quite reverential, which you would expect. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to do a proper study of the early RSS. And in order to understand the early RSS, you have to understand the founder. And what I recognized was that in all the popular discourse in this country, as I say, everybody has an opinion on RSS, whether you love it or you hate it. But most people know very little about it. Its functioning, its early history, its founder, and what I call the Hedgewarian mind. Right? So I wanted to explore how the Hedgewarian mind was formed. Where did all these ideas come from? Right? If you read the RSS hagiographies, they don't tell you. Right? And the impression they give you is that he must have sat under a tree, he's a genius, and he was just inspired. Now, that's not how the world works, right? We are all products of our environment. I come from a realist position. And so I wanted to really get into a deeper exposition of this man, his motives, who were his influences, what were the circumstances in which his ideas were formed, and so on and so forth. And of course, why is this really important? Is because I think his creation, the RSS, has now interwoven itself across the tapestry of Indian society. What's more interesting, now I'm a diasporic child, right? I grew up out in the UK. Now his ideas, the Hedgewarian ideas, are now percolating even in the 30 million strong diaspora.
I see.
Right? So now his ideas have swept into Europe, US, even places like Colombia, Japan, so Africa. So suddenly his ideas are much bigger than even the Indian story now. So that makes him not just a national figure, which he's not, but he needs to be, because he needs to be understood, he needs to be studied. But I think he's going to become a international figure, because his ideas are going to influence the 21st century in some very real sense. And so this was my curiosity that led me into spending 7 years researching. 7 years researching his life, his books. I went to the source materials, the archives in Delhi, the British Library. The British were great at keeping everything, of course. So there's a treasure trove in there, but you have to find it. And then the Delhi Nehru Memorial Library and Museum. I think the name's changed, but that's what it was back then.
Uh-huh.
They had some microfilms of his letters and of his notes. And then, of course, I used a lot of structured and unstructured interviews. I was lucky enough to interview some of the early Swayamsevaks and Pracharaks who were in their 90s when I interviewed them.
Oh, wow, okay.
But they would have been 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds
I see.
at the time of Hedgewar
Ah.
in the early RSS.
Okay.
So that was really fascinating to interview them. Many of them have passed on now. And then, of course, the archives in Nagpur, in the actual RSS archives.
Okay.
These were invaluable. And this was the key bit that makes this book unique, because I don't think another academic has had the opportunity to gaze from the outside in the way I've happened to have had this opportunity. So therefore, I could suppose I could bring to the surface things that maybe we've not done so far.
So how was this idea born to write a book about the Dr. Hedgewar? It took you 7 years. It must have been a process. I'm sure initially you were just operating out of curiosity, I suppose. So what made you curious about him, and what's your background like? I mean, obviously you're of Indian origin. What's your family background like?
Sure. So I was raised in the UK.
Okay.
I have a background in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy.
Okay.
I spent 2 years studying Christian Islamic theology.
Fantastic.
In fact, ironically, both of which proved invaluable. That training proved invaluable to kind of decipher his life and his times.
Okay.
In some interesting sense. So I'm not a biographer. I'm not a historian by training, at least. I'm a philosopher by training. I then spent 12 years in finance in private equity.
Okay.
I retired from that in 2020. And presently, I run a small NGO out of the City of London called the International Centre for Sustainability,
Okay.
where we effectively nudge corporate and government policy towards sustainability.
Okay.
So that's what I do now. When this book started, effectively, I was regularly, and that time I was in the midst of my private equity career.
Okay.
I was a partner, and I was very keen to deploy some capital in an emerging Indian economy. And so I used to come back to India all the time
I see.
to do some research. And what dawned on me was that I really couldn't go anywhere in this country with a curious mind. If you're curious, you'll see it everywhere. And now that I've said this, I'm sure many, many people will come to India and do the same thing, which is you can go to a tribal village, you can go to an Indian Chamber of Commerce, you can go to a trade show, you can go to a small SME business or a corporate house. You will have somebody somewhere connected to the RSS.
Right.
Somehow. It's incredible. Everywhere. Every nook and cranny of this society has some influence somewhere. Now, whether it's good or bad, that's for others to say. And I don't make that comment, right? Who am I to make that judgment? But the influence is there. So I started to ask questions, right? Like who are you? What are you? Why are you? And then I would ask others, like, who are they? What are they? Why are they?
Yeah.
And people had really strong opinions. And in this country, the RSS is quite a polarizing movement. And people love it. People hate it, right? But whoever you asked, on both sides, to my mind, I thought had very weak direct experience or understanding or really any genuine, robust views about this movement.
And why is that so?
Well, it's really interesting. To my surprise, I found that a lot of people within the RSS, over the last 7 years, I've spent a lot of time with the movement, right? And I've seen it from grassroots to all of its different manifestations. Even internally, they would have all heard. So every person within the movement would have heard of Hedgewar. But you ask them anything about Hedgewar, and apart from a few folk tales that they tell each other internally, and a few people who would have read some of the books, even they know nothing about him.
I see.
Right? Now, the reason for that is because the RSS, the Hedgewarian mind, we might want to creep into that then, I suppose, because the Hedgewarian mind is such that he wanted to build a movement that was not human-centric.
Okay, not based on a personality cult or any such thing.
No. And so one of his critiques of Hindu society was that the the Hindu mind has a propensity to create heroes,
To deify
hero worship,
people.
to deify people.
Yeah.
And that deification always led to trouble and fragmentation because it's human nature. So he wanted to build a movement that was not built on any individual.
I see.
And of course, he was very aware that him being the founder in these early 15 years of the movement, he did not want to be at the center of things. So he built a culture where the leader, A, is not to be worshipped, is not reverential. He shouldn't be reverential. Now, whether they are today or not is a different issue.
Okay.
But they shouldn't be reverential, right? Like, so the Sir Sangchalak, right now it's Dr. Mohan Bhagwat,
Yes.
but before him there have been many others.
Yes.
They should not be reverential.
Okay.
They are just human beings of flesh and blood like us. But the reason why the organization may look up to them is for guidance, for advice. But they don't necessarily hold executive power. So he built a organization that was not people-centric. It was diffused of power.
Okay.
So power in this organization. And again, the tropes within Indian discourse, Abhijit, is that people think that Mohan Bhagwat sits on a chair with lots of buttons, like a Star Trek style button, and he presses buttons and millions of people mindlessly do his bidding. You know what I mean?
I know.
And it's not like that. What my research and my data points showed that actually he has very limited power.
Okay.
And the structures around leadership within this organization are such that powers are checked very early on.
I see.
It's really interesting. So, for example, a RSS Karyakarta, somebody who holds responsibility within the movement, could be anything, small or big. That particular person has power to execute his remit, and that's tightly defined within his area.
Okay.
Nobody else can come and tell him, you must do this. Even senior Pracharaks of the order, the people who are kind of lifelong devoted actors, I call them devoted actors from a psychological sense, who give their lives up for this movement, for the Hedgewarian dream, for the Hedgewarian mission. Even these people, they don't hold executive power, or they're not meant to. I mean, I don't know if they do, but they're not meant to hold executive power. So so even people like Mohan Bhagwat, they are there to guide,
Okay.
be a role model.
So it's a position of influence, not power.
Influence rather than direct power or control.
Okay.
So the Hedgewarian mind is such, and his ideas were such, that it should not be personality centric. And so that's why most people don't know him. And that's, I think, a very conscious decision.
So it's a system that essentially prevents what people would call a dictatorial mindset from emerging.
Correct. Absolutely. And which is the irony, right? Because when you read modern discourse, the RSS is authoritarian, it's dictatorial. Mohan Bhagwat sits on his chair, presses buttons, and mindlessly people do his mindless bidding for him. Right? They call him bhakts and all sorts of things, right?
Yes, that's right.
The reality is, it's just not like that. And that's why I think this book is really important, because the data points show something very different. And I have some sympathy for, modern day academia. Not much sympathy, mind you, not much, but some. Because they've not ever had direct access to the RSS.
Right.
Right? For better or worse, or right or wrong, I don't know. But I know that they've not studied the actual text, the actual work of Hedgewar.
So how did you manage to get this access? How did it work? What was the process like?
Yeah, sometimes I have to pinch myself, right? How does a guy like me, private equity guy in London, 5,000 miles away, get access to material that I only realized afterwards very few people get access to? Three things, let's say. One is luck.
Okay.
Right? So where opportunity meets preparation.
That's right.
That's Aristotelian luck. So luck. Number two is I complained enough.
Okay.
So, and I was curious, right? I was genuinely curious. I wanted to deploy quite significant amounts of capital in this country. And so I wanted to understand this country. And when I figured out that this thing called the RSS is everywhere, I naturally wanted to ask questions. I wanted to meet people. I didn't want to study it from a distance or from a theoretical framework. I wanted to know the people. So I engaged. I went to their functions. I met their people. I met Karyakartas, Swayamsevaks, Pracharaks, and I complained that the literature in English is awful. I don't find it accessible. And in the end, I think they got fed up, and one of them said to me, "Look, why don't you do something? And if you think it's so bad, why don't you write something?" And so I laughed it off, of course. I mean, gosh. And again, I kind of just said, look, I have no access to material. I'm not a biographer. Not the right man. I'm a philosopher at best. And even then, from an academic perspective. But they were quite serious. And the third thing was my curiosity. It was my curiosity, and this is my temperament, by the way. My curiosity got the better of me. And I thought, wait a minute. If they're opening the door for me here, even if it's this much, I should really get my shoulder in through the door. And so I did. And I, like I say, sometimes I have to pinch myself. But 7 years later, we have a book, that kind of, I think, sheds a new light on this movement and the mind of Hedgewar.
So it took you 7 years. Why 7 years, first of all? And secondly, how long was the research phase and how long was the writing phase?
Yeah,
and when did you decide that it's ready?
It's a good question. Really good questions. All three. So number one is, I spent the first 4 years researching, maybe more, 4.5 years.
Okay.
That was just hard research. And even then, Abhijit, I have to tell you, I only managed to trawl through maybe 30-40% of the material that's possibly out there.
Okay.
I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. So this should be the beginning of discourse that then other people go, well, I want a piece of this. I can do better. There's holes here. There's holes there. Can I fill them up? So number one is so it's, and that still took me 3.5 to 4 years of just pure research. 30-40%, right? Partly it's the challenge of translation.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Everything he wrote was in code, English, Marathi,
okay,
Hindi and Bengali.
Okay.
Right? So, and
what do you mean by code?
Code because he was constantly watched by the British.
Okay,
so he was part of the struggle. So it's funny, right? So you will see notes. So you will see. In fact, I had a historian tell me this once. He said, "Oh yeah." I interviewed him, and he said, "You won't find much in the archives." I said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, it's all very mundane stuff." I said, "What do you mean?" And he went, "Oh, you'll find trawls and trawls and trawls of little slips where he just asks mundane questions like, how's the weather? Did you go here? Did you see that person?" And it sounds trivial.
Okay, but it's
code.
It's code.
And then you begin to realize that when you see the other side, so for example, him and Dr. Munjay are writing to each other all the time, and it's often in this banal, menial, dry way. But you begin to see that they're actually communicating with each other, right? Because their assumption was whatever we're writing is being intercepted.
Yes.
And the British are watching us. And they were obviously right because I found a lot of stuff in the British Library which the British were watching them.
Which dealt with the surveillance activities.
Absolutely. So for example, the way I found out what Hedgewar studied as a 14 to 17-year-old, those 3 years, formative stages, I found out because the British had a spy watching the school in which he studied at, and he'd made a list of all the things that were on the curriculum.
Okay.
They're in the British Library.
I see.
And so I found out...
So was he identified as a target as a teenager?
Not quite. No, he wasn't, is my understanding.
Okay.
What he was, though, was that he was part of a nexus, part of a group. Anybody who was connected to Dr. Munjay, eyes on, right?
I see.
Because Dr. Munjay was Tilakite. And so these guys were what I call the Republican side of the Congress. These are the guys that from a very early on wanted absolute independence, right? Yeah. Remember, Indians forget, right? That the Congress there was no one Congress. There was many parts of the Congress. And the strongest part of the Congress for many years, who I call the associates, wanted to associate with the British.
Yes.
They wanted to have dominion status, not full independence. These were the guys that wanted full independence, hence I call them Republicans.
Right.
And Tilak was obviously, sort of developing that narrative. So anybody along those sides, the British watched. So because he was a young teenager influenced by Munjay, naturally he was being watched. He meaning the school he was going to was being watched.
Okay.
Because the school he went to between 14 and 17 was a nationalist school.
I see.
It was basically a school for boys who were all expelled from mainstream education because they were all doing seditious extracurricular activity.
I see.
Right? So they were all expelled, and so they were all sent to this school.
Okay.
And so naturally
So
it was being watched. It was sent. Makes sense.
Yes.
Right? And the other thing that I should also bring out on all of this is, in this book, I try and take the reader. So I don't make the judgment whether Keshav Hedgewar becomes a good guy or a bad guy. Right? That's not my aim. What I try and do is I do two things. I try and compartmentalize the development of his mind and body in three parts of his life. So I kind of three broad buckets, which I'll take you through. And then I try and take the reader through India as he would have seen it.
Okay.
So I try and take the reader back to those times of 1889.
It was a different India, wasn't it?
A different India.
Yes.
Different views, different... I even show, which I don't think... to my surprise, maybe, naively, most Indians didn't appreciate, for example, how a lower middle class Indian would have bathed.
Okay.
I bring that to life here.
I see.
Right? I bring to life what medical care was like. I bring to life what the roads were like. What education was like. What the condition of women was like. Right? How the society was fragmented into caste, class, and creed. So I bring all those things to life because I want the reader to see what Hedgewar would have seen.
Okay.
Because until you appreciate the world, for right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but until you appreciate the world through the protagonist's eyes, you can't appreciate where his ideas came from.
That's right.
So that's what I try and do. So those three buckets are basically the first bucket, which is where he's a young man, and it's a life of tragedy.
I see.
And it's a sharp tragedy, and I try and explore that sharp tragedy because he gets orphaned by the age of 12.
I see. Both parents.
Both parents on the same day.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the trauma of that, right?
Okay.
And he is number 5 out of 6 in the pecking order of children.
Okay.
2 older sisters get married very young, teenagers, obviously, in those days.
Yeah.
Right? So child marriages almost. Younger sister, after the plague of 1902, disappears out of history.
I see.
And that's the other thing I show. I show that if you look at Indian archives and records, it's almost like India was only full of men. There's very few women that are recorded.
I see.
That obviously they were there, and obviously they were playing quite a significant role in supporting all these men.
Yes.
But they're just not mentioned anywhere. So it's an incredibly patriarchal society where the women really, or women, are quickly forgotten. They come and go, and that's it, in a passing sway. So his sisters disappear out of history.
I see.
But he was in touch with his sisters, we know, for a very long time because they all lived nearby where he grew up.
Okay.
So the first part is this tragedy of losing your parents, the plague, famines, chaos and uncertainty. Then, there, in my view, again, I'm a realist, there's no such thing as a self-made man. Not today, not then. Behind every genius, there are circumstances. There are people,
Yes.
knowingly or unknowingly, who put them there.
Right.
So in Hedgewar's point, again, for some reason, I don't know why, Indian discourse doesn't talk about this, but his stroke of tragedy, at the point of tragedy at the age of 12, he gets his stroke of luck, which is that one day he's orphaned, and within a very short space of time thereafter, he really, by all intents and purposes, so don't take this literally in a legalistic sense, but in the custom of the day, he was adopted by one of the wealthiest men in Maharashtra.
I see.
His name was Dr. Munjay.
Okay.
Dr. Munjay becomes a father figure for him. Now, Dr. Munjay, whereas he grew up to parents who are very lower middle class, working class, Brahmins that did karmakand, and just kind of scratching out a living.
Okay.
Suddenly, he ends up in the home of one of the wealthiest men in Maharashtra, who's an eye surgeon
I see.
for those days. He's an ex-retired British military officer,
I see.
right, who fought in the Boer Wars.
I see.
So
Wow.
he goes from being an Anglophile. Munjay is an Anglophile, by the way, for most of his life.
I see.
Then after the Boer Wars, Munjay discovers what the British were about and what the empire is about.
That's right.
And then he retreats and he's inspired by Tilak and he becomes a Tilakite. And then he spends his time and money and life into the freedom struggle.
I see.
Now, Munjay is as elite as you can get. Right? The English he would have spoken, the way he dressed, his tastes, they were highly refined from a European perspective. Now, suddenly this man becomes Hedgewar's father figure. So suddenly now, Hedgewar is exposed to the who's who, global ideas, and suddenly he goes from being this conservative, orthodox Brahmin upbringing to reading Nietzsche, the Greek philosophers, Mazzini, Karl Marx. We know by 18, Hedgewar would have consumed the Greek philosophers, Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Mazzini. He would have consumed all of these guys.
I see.
And because of English, he was exposed to global newspapers, global ideas. And so, again, the RSS definitely doesn't emphasize this bit, but I can tell you, it's without doubt in my mind that Hedgewar went from being very average, normal life, albeit tragic and the tragedy, but after this tragedy and once he moves into transitions into this latter part of his childhood, he literally goes from, the humdrum to the top 3% of Indian society.
I see.
Right? And I think people have to appreciate that because only then you understand where this Hedgewarian ideas and mind later come from. Right? That he's a composite mind. He is deeply imbibed in Shivaji Maharaj. He knew the history of Shivaji from a very young age.
I see.
He would have known Ram Das's works, right? The Marathi sadhu who was Shivaji's guru, right? So who wrote the Manobodh, Das Bodh, and these things, these aphorisms, he had already internalized and memorized. In fact, on his deathbed, he is still reciting on his deathbed the Manobodh to his peers. So clearly he was rooted in Indian indigenous thought and philosophy and history. There's no doubt, and quite well versed. But at the same time, what doesn't get said enough is that he was also a product of Enlightenment European thought, which he appreciated critically, but he absorbed a lot of European thought, classical to Enlightenment. So that's that first bit. Then he transitions into what I call a hardcore angry revolutionary.
I see.
Right? Because he sees the destitution of the Indian society.
Yes.
The poverty, the decrepitation. By the way, he sees the how harsh life was for the poor and for women. These things he talks about, he writes about later on. But you can see that his ideas are formed in these early stages. So he becomes this angry revolutionary where he basically wants to cause or be part of an armed revolution. So he's at the sharp end of the freedom struggle, right? This guy is not giving speeches. He's literally learning how to make bombs.
I see.
He actually explodes a few bombs.
I see.
One of them failed detonation, which gets his uncle into all sorts of trouble. I talk about that. It's quite funny, but it's also quite scary. He's a teenager, right? Lots of testosterone and idealism. So he does some crazy things that only a testosterone-driven teenager can do, right? So I kind of bring him to life and I kind of show that. He then goes into university, medical college, and why would he have studied medicine? Think about who his father figure was, right?
That's right.
Now it makes sense. But while he's studying medicine in the day, at night he's trawling through dark alleyways in Calcutta, raising money and then buying firearms from the British military. So bribing officers.
I see.
And then those arms he was smuggling across Maharashtra.
That's dangerous work.
It's crazy work, right? So if he would have been arrested in those periods, he would have faced the gallows or he would have faced a lifetime in the Andaman Islands, right?
Yes.
The Kalapani, as they call it.
Yes. Yeah.
So he is definitely on the edge of existence at this time. And it's kind of something you can make a movie out of, I'm sure, right? I mean, it's pretty exciting stuff. He's also, people don't appreciate this, the British describe him as 6'2", built like a wrestler.
I see.
So he's a tough guy.
It's a big unit.
It's a big unit. And for those days as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Right? He's a tough guy. And he put his toughness to good use. I mean, he beat up quite a few people in that period. Again, people have romanticized him. I try and humanize him. So he does go around beating people up. He goes looking for fights.
I see.
He's a tough guy and he knows he can do it, right? So he takes advantage of it. And that's him. That's his temperament. He gets that from his father. His father's a bit of a hothead. His older brother is a bit of a hothead. So it's kind of a Hedgewarian trait, it seems. But then he transitions, he discovers that actually these armed militancy and the armed violent way isn't going to be enough to oust the British. He kind of comes to this realization while he's in Calcutta.
I see.
That actually there's some systemic problems that the Indian society has that is not being addressed through this. So no matter how many bombs you explode, no matter how many British officers you end up killing, this is not how the struggle is going to be won. So then he transitions out of that into what I call political nationalism.
Okay.
He joins the INC, the Indian National Congress. He naturally joins the Republican side of the Congress because of his father figure, Munjay and Tilak, and then Aurobindo Ghosh.
I see.
He's also heavily influenced by Aurobindo Ghosh.
I see.
This is, again, not discussed much, but Aurobindo Ghosh was a big influence on him.
Okay.
And in fact goes to spend 3 days with him in Pondicherry when Aurobindo Ghosh is hiding out
I see.
in Pondicherry.
Okay, that time.
Under the French colony, and he goes to see him. So he goes into that and goes into this political nationalist mode where he says, okay, well, there must be a political solution to this, and so on and so forth. And then the third bucket is he realizes that actually the problem here is his final stage of his kind of, I would say, revelation, is that he says that the problem isn't the British, actually. And that's a big shift, right? The problem is no longer the British in his mind. The problem are not Muslims or the Christians or some bygone Islamic invasions and all of that. He sees all of these things that fragments India as a symptom of a root cause.
Okay.
And he says the problem with Indian society are the Indians, which is quite radical, right? I mean, it's quite a honest, heart-wrenching thing for a young man who's just risked best part of 25 years of his life in the struggle to oust an enemy that he now realizes is just a symptom. And actually the problem that needs to be solved are the Indian people.
Okay.
And what is that problem? And he basically says that Indians are rooted in caste, class, and creed.
Okay.
Indian society is fragmented in these 3 ways. And he says what's happened over the last few centuries, he diagnoses, is that social mobility in Indian society had come to a standstill.
Yes.
There was no social mobility. You were condemned to your fate.
Society had been ossified.
Ossified completely, right? Now, a society like that cannot innovate,
No, it can't.
cannot cooperate. In fact, trust between Indians was no longer there. It had evaporated.
I see.
And he talks about this as a lack of coordination and a lack of cooperation, right? In today's language, I call it social capital.
Okay.
Right? Robert Putnam's Social Capital. If somebody wants to understand the Hedgewarian mind, I would say go and read Robert Putnam's Social Capital and how he describes social capital. That will help you a lot in understanding the Hedgewarian mind, right? Because Hedgewar was onto something similar
Okay.
in the Indian context. And so what he says is, because he sees the innovation of the British, he now sees the British with awe, by the way.
Okay.
Right? That these guys, sure, they're oppressors, that there's a tyranny, there's despotism, they're exploitative, but they are incredibly knowledgeable. They are innovative. They are pioneering. They're disciplined. They're loyal to their own kin, right? And so on and so forth.
Yes.
The exact opposite of the Indian society. So he basically says that what has happened in Indian society is that social capital has evaporated. Now, what is social capital, Abhijit? Right? Very quickly. Social capital is basically my ability to trust you. Human to human.
Yes.
Can I trust you? Now, how is trust built? Trust is built when I can sit with you, I can talk with you, I can argue with you,
That's right.
I can eat with you, right? I can marry into your family and you can marry into my family. When these things are there, we can go into business together.
That's right.
When those things are fluid, trust is built.
Yes.
With trust comes cooperation and coordination. With that comes society and civic organizations. And only through civic cooperation can you then have innovation.
That's right.
Right? I mean, it sounds logical. It is logical.
It is.
Now, that has dried up. So without trust, Indian society fragments.
That's right.
Fragments into caste, class, and creed. And none shall cooperate with each other. And so it's there for the taking, basically, isn't it? It's there to be exploited. It's there to be used. And first, the Islamic invasions occur. And they occur. I mean, I know Indians may not like to accept this, but, they were relentless and they were constantly, it was a 700, 600 year
That's right.
decay. It wasn't an overnight thing.
Yes.
But it happened. Then Portuguese, Dutch, British, French, they all came in, they all tried, and they could all see it. They saw an incredibly, once upon a time, rich civilization
Yes.
there for the taking.
Yes.
Hedgewarian diagnosis was that social capital had dried up. So then the third phase of his life is the RSS.
Okay.
Is where he spends 15 years of his life, the last 15 years, not just so in his political nationalist days, while he's part of the INC, he's formulating this critique of Indian society. And he's beginning to understand what might be a solution.
Okay.
In his last 15 years, he leaves political nationalism, goes into cultural nationalism,
Okay.
and he starts experimenting.
Okay.
Now, the RSS was an experiment. Again, I don't think people appreciate this. From his perspective, he was not onto something. He didn't sit under a tree and go, Eureka, right? I've solved the problem. Now let me go and do it. It really was an experiment.
Okay.
It was a social experiment. He doesn't even name the RSS until 18 months after he started the experiment.
I see.
Right? And the early experiment of the RSS was along British military lines.
Okay.
It was the language of the RSS was English,
I see.
right? Throughout his life, while he was alive.
I see.
The language of the RSS was English.
I
Isn't that interesting?
It's interesting.
Very interesting,
Very
isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
So these things are there. Now, what his solution is very simple. Forget the British. Forget all this fragmentation of caste, class, and creed. The root problem is social capital. The fact is, Indians cannot get their identities, cannot get their psychologies out of religion, caste, and class. So creed, right?
Yes.
So he creates a space, a safe space, called the Shaka.
Okay.
It's essentially, in his day, it's a akhada. It's like a gymnasium.
Okay.
Tough guys come to train. You know, that's what it is. It's tough guys come to train. They learn martial arts. They learn, hand-to-hand combat, knife fighting, stick fighting. And by the way, these guys are tough guys. Huh? They're tough. They're not the kind of RSS you see today.
I see.
These guys would have been lean. They would have been tough. And they were. What was happening was that the space was casteless, classless, and creedless.
Okay.
So suddenly, in this safe space where you met for 1 hour, 2 hours a day, every day, you ate together, you spoke together, you got to know each other, you got beyond linguistic barriers, you got past race barriers, tribal barriers, caste barriers, and suddenly they could cooperate, they could trust each other. There was a brotherhood, right? And suddenly that surplus capital, social capital, then Hedgewar points it towards society building. So now you guys all trust each other, the Shaka, you all trust each other. Well, we see poverty over there. Let's sort that poverty out. We see that backwardness over here, or there's a mandir that's been derelict. Let's go and fix it, right? Or here's a neighborhood that's being harassed by lawlessness and what have you. Right, we'll go and police that neighborhood. So suddenly, this surplus social capital spills over into the local communities.
The question is, how do you fund all this? Because you need
Money.
So
Yeah.
where does that come from?
Fascinating, isn't it? So the early RSS is bootstrapped.
Okay.
Obviously. Very, very bootstrapped. But do remember that Hedgewar's godfather was Munjay.
Yes.
Munjay was never short of cash,
I see.
right?
Okay.
So there's some clue there for you. But also, Hedgewar, while he was very comfortable, intermingling with the poorest of Indian society, right, and the downtrodden, which he was also equally au fait because of his English, because of his etiquettes. Remember, he was a very polished man. He was also very au fait with speaking to the elite of Indian society. He could actually traverse both ends.
I see.
Right? He could straddle both ends. And so I show in the book that Hedgewar, from the age of 13 or 14, by Tilak and Munjay, had inadvertently been trained to raise money.
I see.
This man could raise money.
I see.
And so Hedgewar took it upon himself to raise the money that they required to run the early RSS.
I see.
Now remember that the early RSS is voluntary. Everything is voluntary, right? So you didn't need much money. Everything was done outdoors. It was done, and it was all voluntary basis. So, but yes, the things that they did need, he either used his connections to borrow, payment in kind, and when they needed cash, they had to raise the cash.
Okay.
But I have to tell you, again, he creates a unique mechanism to raise money.
Okay.
He says to everybody that I don't want your money, I want you.
Okay.
So become part of the RSS. Become part of the Shaka. Go through some basic training.
Okay.
Come and meet your fellow Swayamsevaks. So he would force people into this casteless, classless, creedless space. And including for the rich. So even when the super wealthy or the super castes would arrive into the RSS space, many of them didn't survive. Because many of them said, hey, I'm a Brahmin. I can't sit next to him. I can't eat next to him. And they would leave. And so again, people don't appreciate this, but Hedgewar was controversial in his time.
I see.
And he was brave enough to disrupt the society. He was brave enough to challenge the status quo within his own community. Right? Within his own community. So he is able to bring these people into the Shaka, and through the influence, through kind of what I call showing, not telling, he shows them what this space could be like, and some people are inspired by it. And
Right.
those people who have money give him money.
Okay.
And so this is how it works. This is how it becomes a snowball effect, slowly.
Okay.
And by the way, the mechanism is still the same. If you look at the RSS literature or the RSS mechanisms of fundraising, they will tell you today that we only raise money from our own Swayamsevaks.
I see.
So they don't take government money. They never have, right? All the thousands and thousands of buildings that the RSS might be using today in India, across the tapestry of India, to my understanding, to my data points, I think hardly any, if any, I didn't find any, by the way, that were owned by the RSS.
I see.
So they don't own anything. So this is the Hedgewarian approach, right? This is the Hedgewarian approach. And the only time they would do fundraising was on Guru Purnima. Yeah. On that one time of the year, people would have to come anonymously and give, as a ghost giver, basically whatever you could afford. So therefore, whether you were rich, poor, whatever, you could never showboat and say, I gave this much money.
It was anonymous.
Yeah, it was anonymous. Nobody ever found out who gave how much.
I see.
Still is like that, by the way.
I see.
Still is like that. So that tradition comes from the Hedgewarian times. So this was his genius. He built a system that could build social capital from whether your class, caste, or creed. And which is why I think, and what I'm going to say is controversial, and I think this book will raise a bit of debate. From the Hedgewarian perspective, he had designed the RSS to encompass the entirety of the Indian society, which meant Muslims, which meant Christians, which meant Buddhists, which meant atheists, right? It meant the whole society. So when I say creedless, from the Hedgewarian perspective, it really is creedless. Now, I am not commenting on the modern RSS.
Okay.
Because that's not my forte. What I can tell you, and I can confidently tell you, is from the Hedgewarian perspective, this is meant to be a creedless space.
I see.
Right? So now, when you look at the overtures that we see today in today's discourse, RSS is equivocated to Hindu supremacism, right? Even Brahmanism, right? All of this sort of stuff.
Okay.
It's the exact opposite of what Hedgewar was all about, and the Hedgewar and what the early RSS was all about. We know in the early RSS, because we have the registers, there were Dalits in the RSS, there were Brahmins in the RSS, they were people of all societies. We know that there were even Muslims into the early RSS, because their names are there in these registers. But what I think sidelined and got Hedgewar sort of, I suppose, distracted, if I can call it that, is that geopolitical winds, right?
Okay.
We are all subject to the world in which we live.
Indeed.
It was because of the geopolitical winds that were happening outside of India and then within India that meant that the early RSS between 1927 to 1935, that period, that 8 period, it constantly looked to the British as if the RSS was constantly the bulwark against Muslim aggression,
I see.
Muslim activism. Now we can go into that if you like, but basically, one of my point is that in those 8 years, that was the time frame that gives the RSS the stamp as being anti-Muslim.
I see. Those 8 years.
Those 8 years.
So what was going on in the time? At the time?
So what happened was in 1918, World War I ends.
Yes.
When World War I ends, the Europeans win the war.
Yes.
And they dissolve
Turkey,
the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire is the seat of the Caliph.
Indeed, the Caliphate.
Now, for 1400 years. Now again, Indians don't appreciate this, but in the Muslim worldview, even today, there has always been the community of the pious,
The Ummah.
right, the Ummah, who are then protected by a Caliph.
That's right.
Always. So and in a way, it was testament that Islam was the word of God because of the way in which Islam had grown, the way in which Islam had influenced the world, and therefore there was always a caliph in place. Always. Good caliphs, bad caliphs, different, by the by. Point is, there was always a caliph in the Islamic world, right?
That's right.
Suddenly, the caliph is gone.
Well, it's Ataturk who dissolves the Caliphate.
Right. And the European powers make this happen.
Yeah.
Now, what happens is this causes a crisis of faith across Islam. Across Islam. What I'm saying is not controversial, by the way. Any scholar worth his salt will pretty much say what I'm about to tell you. Which is that what you broadly got, is you got 3 buckets, 3 reactions from the Islamic world. You got the Ataturk reaction, which basically said, this humiliation, that's what it was, it's a humiliation of Islam, comes out because of Islam. Islam is the problem. It's backwards, it's no longer fit for purpose, it's holding the people back.
That was the Kemalist viewpoint.
Yes, we need to go back to being Turkic.
Yes.
So he falls back on a nationalist identity, right? Because that was the heady days of his times.
Yes.
Where nationalism, political nationalism, was kind of the currency of the day. So if you were an anti-imperialist, if you're an anti-colonialist, you were a political nationalist, right? So he falls back on this idea of Turkicness, and therefore he wanted to diminish the influence of Islam.
He did that.
And he did that.
Yes.
So that's one group. The other group were journalists, artists, academics. And what they basically said is, look, no, Islam has produced a lot of good in the world. There's a lot of currency, a lot of value in Islam. But yes, Islam treats women pretty badly. It is now out of touch with science and technology, and we've fallen way behind. So Islam needs to be reformed. And these were the reformists, right? They influenced a lot of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, right? In those 50s, 60s, and 70s. Very, very progressive, right? They adopted Western economics, so on and so forth.
Yes.
Now, I don't know why. So I confess, I don't know why. But in India, in the subcontinent of India, we got schools that took prominence that were incredibly regressive. Deobandi Islam, Berveli Islam, which are very akin to Salafi and Wahhabi Islam.
I think they had support from the British and such elements.
Well, no. So in this book, I tell you, the support didn't just come from the British. And actually, I don't think it was the British.
Okay.
I think it was the INC and Gandhi.
Well, that angle we have not even come to.
Come to yet.
Yes.
But
it
I
is
can,
Gandhi at the end of the day.
and I've got evidence for it.
Oh yes.
So anyway, and I think it was easy to blame the British for everything because it was convenient for everybody. But when you now look at with a clear eye, you begin to see that there was something else going on. We'll come to that.
Yes.
But let me just finish this point about the cause. So for some reason in India, you have these seminaries, Deobandi seminaries. Now, they've been there since 1857, by the way, after the First War of Independence.
The First War, yes.
But they never took prominence. Indian Muslims never took them seriously.
So who brought them to prominence?
Correct.
Indeed.
Who brought them to prominence?
That's the question.
That is a good question. Now, I'm not a scholar of those times, so I'm not going to comment because it's not my job to comment. But I hope somebody answers that question in the next 5 years. It needs answering.
I have a talk called The Turkish Origins of India's Partition.
Well, there you go.
Yes.
So
it
that
was
is
like
gonna,
5-6 years ago, and in which I have said Gandhi.
Great. So there you go. Great.
Yeah.
So you've got it. We'll talk about that in a minute, I'm sure. So that comes to prominence. Now, what happens is these clerics are stoking 2 ideas within Indian Muslims. Now, Indian Muslims, people don't appreciate this, are actually quite progressive. Indian Muslims are a progressive bunch.
Comparative
Comparative to today and to what we, the kind of Deobandi form of Islam, Indian Muslims are very progressive. They want to educate. They want to get into the civil service. Many of them join the military. They're part parcel of society. I mean, they're scholars. They write poetry. They are contributing to the culture. I mean, there's no doubt about that, right? I mean, anyway. So, and I think, by the way, Hedgewar appreciates all of that because Hedgewar had a very close friend when he was at university, a Maulvi, who was of the second form. So he was not the one that said get rid of Islam, and he was not the orthodox. He was a reformist Muslim Maulana.
I see.
And Hedgewar spent significant time with him. So my conjecture is that Hedgewar would have known about some of these tailwinds that were within Islam.
I see.
And therefore, he had recognized that actually Muslims were having a rupture within the Islamic world, which the Hindus are totally ignorant of, which is that they were being torn towards modernity and conservatism. And what the Deobandi Beverly sort of clerics were saying, they were stoking on 2 points. One is, well, now that the British are retreating from their empire, because after World War I, they were in a bit of financial trouble.
Yes.
What's going to happen to you lot? Now the Caliph is gone. Who's going to protect you?
Yes.
Right? It's not going to be the Hindus. Well, you better protect yourself.
Okay.
And so what happens? This fear-mongering starts. This the other gets created. And who is this other? The kafir. Right? So this kafir gets created. Okay, that's one. Number two is, and you Muslims, you're not pious enough.
Okay.
You've been corrupted. Jalaliya. Right? The idea of Jalaliya comes in.
Jahiliya.
Right? It's my pronunciation. Right? Comes along. And then their argument is you have to look towards the Rashidin, right? The rightly guided ones, the four rightly guided ones for your inspiration. So then they start imitating things from the 7th century, right? And now suddenly over 2, 3, 4 decades, this becomes the Indian version of Islam. Now this is fueled by clerics from a few seminaries.
Pretty obscure guys.
Yes,
Indeed.
it is not mainstream Indian Islam. It really isn't. And I challenge anybody who tells me otherwise, because if you read the Urdu that was coming out of Indian Islam between 1860 and 1910-ish, that sort of period, it's really sort of provocative.
Okay.
It's sensual. It's kind of very... it's kind of entertaining, interesting stuff. And then suddenly after the 1920s, thou shalt not talk about sex. We shall put women in their boxes, and they ghettoize themselves.
I see.
Right? And of course, what is the consequence of that? In 1921, you get the euphemism of the Mapila riots. Right? They were not riots, they were a massacre.
Yeah, it was a massacre.
What were those massacres about? It was simply about riling up these Muslim youths from these seminaries and saying to them that you're under threat, your lives are under threat, you're not pious enough, so become pious, arm up, and build your Dar es Salaam here. And that's what these, in my view, poor Mapila men were brainwashed over decades under the guise of the British and the Indians and the INC, and they were sold a false dream. They rioted, they massacred, first the British officers, the Indian military, and then the Hindus around them. First the zamindars, but then even the poor.
Yes.
Right? And there's evidence of that, amples of it.
Ample.
And then, of course, the British come along and slaughter all of them, and pretty violently. I just think, what a human tragedy. What an absolute waste, right? Because bad ideas were allowed to ferment, and nobody understood what these bad ideas were. And so Hedgewar gets really scarred by these movements.
I see.
And so that, in 1925, when he forms the RSS as this experiment, by 1927, this same radicalism within this clerical class of Islam comes to Nagpur.
I see.
And that same idea comes to roost in Nagpur in 1927, when basically Hindu processions across Nagpur are stopped by these clerics and by a few Muslim youths. These are not thousands of people. Few Muslim youths stop processions, stop Hindu festivals, and they basically start intimidating, because it's lawlessness, right? The British can no longer regulate the streets of second, third tier Indian cities, never mind the villages. And so in this lawlessness, tough guys rule.
Indeed.
Right? And Indian society, being fragmented as it was, could not organize itself. And so in this lawless space, these clerical voices not just intimidated Hindus, they intimidated Muslims.
I see.
They sidelined any Muslim cleric, any Muslim Maulana scholar, any Muslim youth who dared to go against their version of Islam.
I see.
Were also beaten up, were also dehoused, were also forced to migrate.
I see.
So we often don't talk enough about this, but actually this radical class of clerics have been a bane for Indian society, for everybody, not Hindus, but for everybody, right? And so what happens in this period is that in 1927, when these insecure angry youths are led by these, I would class them as misled clerics, the RSS is now there, right? It's 2 years old. And the RSS sees what's going on. And Hedgewar becomes the vanguard. The RSS becomes the vanguard. Not just for the Hindu community, but for everybody. For everybody who wants to resist these clerics and these youths, they become the vanguard. And now clashes start happening.
I see.
And what happens is, because the RSS is trained in military combat. They're trained as a military unit. They're tough guys. They begin to fight back and they win. And suddenly, the rest of the society starts saying, whoa, I've got this problem in my village. I've got this problem in my city. I've got this problem in my town. Please start a shakha here. Please start a shakha here. And suddenly, the RSS from 1927 to 1940 just exponentially grows.
I see.
And where does it grow? Wherever there are these clerical threats. So that's where this reputation comes out.
I see.
That RSS equals anti-Muslim. Not the case. If you look at the subtleties of the dialogues, of the letter correspondences, of why the RSS was asked to go there, why Hedgewar's intent was not to other the Muslim. It was in fact to incorporate the Muslim, right? Under the umbrella of Desh Bhakti, right? Now, he felt that Muslims could be brought under the umbrella of Desh Bhakti. So you could be Muslim, no problem. Like the Maulana that he'd been influenced by, who was a Desh Bhakt, but still a Muslim. So he felt that could be done. But not for these clerics, because for these clerics, the Deobandi clerics, the Beverly clerics, Desh Bhakti is a form of idolatry. And idolatry is what is the problem with Islam, remember?
Okay.
That's why God is punishing us. That's why the caliphate has been dissolved. So all of this stuff is going on in the 1920s, and the RSS, to some extent, is swept up in that.
I see.
And so, and that reputation then gets formed, right?
So how did Dr. Hedgewar envisage the RSS? Was it supposed to be a non-religious organization, a secular organization, or did it have a Hindu identity of sorts?
So it's a really good question. And we can split hairs into this, right? So my understanding is that the word Hindu had different connotations.
It meant Indian.
Yeah,
it was
it
an
meant
ethnic
Indian.
term. Yes.
It meant Indian in the
Yes.
Hedgewarian mind.
I mean, when the Persians and Arabs spoke of Hindus, they meant Indians.
They meant Indians. They even called
Yes.
Muslims Hindus.
Yes, indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
So from the Hedgewarian mind, it's a Hindu organization. It's a Hindu movement, sorry. But like I say, it's a casteless, classless, creedless movement.
Okay.
That we have evidence of. So creedless means that there is space here for all beliefs, all faiths. To the point where, again, people don't appreciate this enough. The early Swayamsevaks who joined the RSS went on to leave the RSS and form, they were some of the founding members of the Communist Party of India.
What?
How much more atheist can you get? Right?
I see, really.
So the RSS was meant to be all-encompassing.
I see.
You could have an Orthodox Brahmin at one end, a Muslim cleric at one end, and then you can have a hardcore atheist communist at the other end. All under the banner of Desh Bhakti.
I see.
Nation first, right? And by Desh Bhakti, it's not what in today's discourse we call patriotism. From the Hedgewarian perspective, Desh Bhakti was not patriotism.
So what was it?
That's a really good one. So I haven't found an English equivalent, right? So I do describe it though. And what I describe it as is Desh Bhakti is that psychological shift where effectively my sense of self, my ego, extends out into the very soil of my land, right? So Desh Bhakti, Desh meaning soil, right? I become one, unified with the soil.
Okay.
Now that means whatever the soil produces is also mine.
Okay.
That means the mountains, the rivers, the fauna, the vegetables, the animals, but also the culture, also the people, including people of all beliefs. So Desh Bhakti is an all-encompassing thing to all those people who are rooted to the very soil.
Okay.
Now, that's what the RSS was designed to bring all these people together onto one platform. But that was the red line. Make no mistake, that's the red line.
Desh Bhakti.
Desh Bhakti. If you cannot be a Desh Bhakt, now you're the other. You're the other. Now, if you think Desh Bhakti is idolatry, you're the other. If you think caste is what the society should be built on, you're the other. Right? So
it's a very clear definition.
Very clear. And he was very clear. It then later, I think, gets muddled by popular discourse. I'm not saying the RSS are muddled, because as far as I can see, RSS still talk about Desh Bhakti, right? They still talk about this stuff. But again, lack of language, maybe lack of linguistic hygiene. Desh Bhakti has been poorly equivocated to patriotism. What is patriotism, and why the Hedgewarian mind would have been skeptical about patriotism?
So what's the difference between patriotism, nationalism, and Desh Bhakti?
Yes. Yes. We should really split hairs here because it makes all the difference. Political nationalism is essentially where you believe that the Rajya, if I can use that word, the state, right? Not the government, the state is real, and you have to capture the state and its power, and then engineer the society.
That's the Ataturk model. Yes.
Yeah. That's political nationalism. Savarkar is a political nationalist. Bose is a political nationalist. Gandhi is a political nationalist. Nehru is a political nationalist. These are all political nationalists. Fine. A cultural nationalist says the exact opposite. He says the state, the Rajya, is secondary or imaginary. What is real is the Rashtra, right? The people, communities are real. And only when the communities form surplus social capital, they have a common consensus of history, of tastes, of ambitions, of aspirations. When these things happen, that then the Rajya emerges, that then a state emerges out of that. Hedgewar went from being a political nationalist into being a cultural nationalist, which is why he calls it the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, not the Rajya Swayamsevak. He's not serving the state of India, he's serving the Rashtra.
The people.
The people, right? So these are the difference between political nationalism and cultural nationalism. Now it's patriotism. Voltaire tells us best. And by the way, Hedgewar would have read Voltaire, right? Candide. Hedgewar would have been exposed to Candide, which is amazing when you think about it, right? Anyway, so Voltaire tells us, right, that patriotism essentially is what state actors use to consolidate power. So now we can play this out, right? Look at modern India. If I'm the chief minister of my state, in order to consolidate my power, I have to create an in-group and an out-group. And more likely than not, those in-groups are on linguistic lines, ethnic lines, religious lines, caste lines. All these things are happening. All of these are abhorrent to the Hedgewarian mind. But he was clear, because that's what political nationalists will always do, because they want to secure power in the Rajya, right? Which is divisive. So patriotism, by its very nature, it will divide, and ultimately, patriotism gone to its final end leads to conflict. Whether it's inter-society or intra-society, that's a different thing, but it will lead to conflict.
Okay.
Hedgewar had a different perspective. He wanted Desh Bhakti to be the underpinnings, i.e., casteless, classless, creedless. And if you can connect with the very idea of the soil of the land, and people were to buy into the Rashtra, the idea of the Rashtra, then technically you can continuously practice who you are, so you keep your differentiation while being unified by a common consensus.
So you continue to practice the religion, it's perfectly fine, but over here in this space, we don't let that be a barrier between us.
Correct. And then what naturally would happen out of that is that a common Rashtra gets built, i.e., so a Muslim may go and do namaz 5 times a day in a mosque.
Yeah.
And they have a particular form of worship. Fine, no problem. A Hindu may go and do his rituals, no problem. But they both have a common consensus that this is our land. And we are brothers on this land. Right? We are sisters on this land. Therefore, we are both stewards of this land. The idea of stewardship is really powerful.
It's a very powerful idea.
Yes. And
we're not owners, we're stewards.
Yes, stewards.
That's right.
And this idea of stewardship is there. You know what's interesting? Even in popular RSS folklore, even today, this idea of stewardship is told through storytelling.
I see.
And I give some of those stories in the book. So how the Hedgewarian mind has continued through storytelling. So these are the differences between patriotism, Desh Bhakti, cultural nationalism, political nationalism.
Okay.
And I think in order to understand the story that India is telling itself and the direction, India is still at a formative stage of its society.
Indeed.
And I think if we can practice this linguistic hygiene, which I hope this book gives some scaffolding to, then I think it will serve us well.
And you mentioned patriarchy is one of the issues that he identified, that women existed but they were invisible. So did he take any steps to address that?
So the short answer is yes, but he does it much later. So he does it he does it sporadically in his own individual capacity from the get-go.
Okay.
But from an organizational perspective, it happens in 1936.
Okay.
11 years after the founding of the RSS.
So in what way does it happen?
So two things. So I'll come to that just to give some context.
Yes.
I found evidence, and I'm sure there's many more evidence, but I found 2 evidence which really scarred him. One was he was a medical student.
Yes.
And there was a flood in one of the local rivers had burst his banks, and some of the villages were flooded.
Okay.
And there was cholera outbreak. And obviously in India at that time there was shortage of doctors, and so they asked medical students to come and help, volunteer. So him and his 5 friends went.
Okay.
One of his 5 friends, ironically, incidentally, was Narayan Savarkar, Veer Savarkar's younger brother.
I see.
Anyway, so they went off and they do this. What he saw scarred him, because what he saw was cholera everywhere and dysentery, which are curable. They were trained for it. All the doctors were male. Sicknesses everywhere. But because of the customs, the traditions of Indian society of that time, men could not administer medication or drugs to women who were not of their kin.
Okay.
So there he was, being able to treat men and save their lives. Right next to them is their wives and their daughters, who he can't even look at.
I see.
And they die. They suffer. And that scars him. What kind of society?
Imagine how that crept into our society. But that's a different story.
Yeah. But it was there. And so it harms him. That is something that really scratches him deeply, I believe. One. Number 2 is he would have seen what happened to his sisters. Right? This idea that, girls really had very little autonomy in life.
Okay.
Right? Unless you are incubated by money and some privilege, which is very few, women really were left to their own luck, circumstances, fate, right? Who you married, who you had children with, whether he could have 1 wife or 3 wives, whether you ended up marrying as a 15-year-old or 60-year-old man. These things were happening. And I think there was trauma that I think he was scarred by it. I think there's an incident where he takes it upon himself to basically gate crash a wedding there's a 60-year-old man who's wanting to marry a 15-year-old girl.
Okay.
Right? Could you imagine that? And he basically gate crashes the wedding. He says that all of this is adharmic. This is all really bad. I'm just caricaturing. And he's a big guy, remember? And he's a toughie. And so he intimidates everybody. He rescues the girl and his mother. And he takes her out. And then he makes sure that a few years later, she does marry somebody who is, of equal suiting.
I see.
Now, that was an incredibly radical thing to do. And he was doing these kind of things throughout. But in 1936, a lady called Lakshmi Kelkar pops up. Lakshmi Kelkar is a widow.
Okay.
Widowed at the age of 28, I think.
Sad.
Very young. But she had inherited a fortune from her husband.
Okay.
Absolute fortune. And in Indian society, once you were widowed, that was the end of love. It's as if you cannot love again. Right? That was it. So you couldn't remarry. So never mind anything else. So what does a widow do with all this surplus money who can never remarry again? She has children. She has 2 young children.
I see.
These 2 young children happen to be going to a shaka. She sees the influence of the shaka. Casteless, classless, creedless. And tough. Disciplined. So she, who is now incubated from the devastation what a normal widow would go through because of wealth, a stupendous wealth, she goes to Hedgewar and says, why aren't you doing this for women? And he says, and his answer really is, yes, I've been waiting for you. Right? Off you go. Start. Now, the question comes is, if he was so passionate about women and women emancipation, which I think he was, why didn't he do something himself? Well, it's because he was already breaking so many societal norms, right? That now incorporating women into martial arts and hand-to-hand combat and, it just would have been a step too far.
A step too far.
Too far. So he was trying to wait for the right group of women to show up who could then start off a parallel organization that could equally radically emancipate
Parallel
women.
organization, not the same organization.
Not the same, parallel organization.
Okay.
Again, the society wouldn't allow it, right?
Okay.
The society just wasn't ready for that.
I see.
Right? And so you have the birth of then what's called the RSS, but the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Samiti.
I see,
right?
I see.
That gets formed.
I see.
And that gets formed on exactly similar lines to the RSS. Women get together on a daily basis. They do, and can you believe this? For the 1930s, women of wealth and destitution can get together in one space. They train. In those days, women were learning hand-to-hand combat because the society was lawless, remember? Hand-to-hand combat. They were learning how to fire guns. They were doing charity work out in the community. So again, pointed social capital. And for those days and times, they were breaking dress barriers. They were breaking caste barriers. They were, so it was a really radical. Lakshmi Kelkar had founded a incredibly radical, progressive women's organization for those times. Today, whether it's that or not, that's for others to say. But certainly at that time, this is how the women's side gets formed. And Hedgewar is at the heart of all of this. Hedgewar basically deputizes some of his lieutenants to go and support the women's wing and upskill them.
So does this separate women's wing still exist?
Yes. It's still there. It's not as big. It's not as big. And to my mind, and let me be a bit controversial, you may get some hate mail, is that to my mind, the women's wing is no longer progressive. It's become quite conservative.
I see.
Quite orthodox. Quite, they will still give talks today that women shouldn't wear jeans.
I see.
Women shouldn't wear makeup.
Okay.
The Lakshmi Kelkar of the world, I don't think would have bought into that story for 2024.
I see.
So certainly something has gone on there. I don't know what it is. But they are still run independently.
Okay.
They're both independent organizations. Whereas the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, has, I think on the whole, maintained progressiveness and tried to consistently absorb the wideness of Indian society. I'm not sure if the women's side has. I didn't see any evidence for that.
I see.
But again, that's not my job to comment on really. But historically, certainly the women's side was radical, progressive, and they were trying to emancipate women from the tyranny of custom and tradition.
So the RSS from that 7 or 8 year period between 27 to 35 or so, it becomes the bulwark against lawlessness and all that. And then what happens after post 35?
So what happens after that is that, so it carries on, but what happens is, you see, it grows. It grows to such a degree that the political nationalists start looking at this.
I see.
And go, well, who the hell are you? You're meant to be one of us. So now, Gandhi, who goes to see Hedgewar, they spend 1 hour together.
I see.
And I talk about that in the book. We have some of the transcript.
I see.
And it's an interesting conversation.
So what's Gandhi's perspective on the RSS?
He on the one hand really admires the casteless, classless, creedless space.
Okay.
And he goes to see it. And he comments on this. In fact, he visits it twice in his lifetime. One when Hedgewar was alive, and one in 1947, during the partition.
I see.
And he admires it both times. So yes, he admires that bit. The bit that worries him is that he sees the latent strength of the RSS, the physical strength. And he says, my God.
He wasn't a big fan of that, was he?
If these guys keep going at the rate that they are, they could challenge a political nationalist. This cultural nationalist organization could also become a bulwark to political ambitions. Because it was growing that fast. And that worried him. That did worry him. And because remember, political nationalists, they want to monopolize violence. What I mean by that is, I don't mean that in a moral sense. I mean that in a political, philosophical sense. The state, in any civilized society, the state monopoly on violence. Yeah. So Gandhi wanted the state to monopolize violence. The RSS was saying, hell no, the Rashtra will have some authority on checks and balances.
That's a rather American approach, isn't it?
Isn't it? Isn't it just?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Isn't it just? That's another point somebody should talk about and think about. But yes, isn't it just? So the Hedgewarian mind is clear that even the state needs checks and balances, right? And therefore you should have a class of citizens who are proactive, tough, who can check even state violence. Think about emergency and who stepped forward, right? In the 1970s in India. Again, it goes back to the Hedgewarian conditioning. So basically, to your point about 1935, 1940, the RSS is still relatively small compared to today, but it's potent enough and it's got scale enough that it begins to worry the INC. So it begins to worry the British.
It's growing out of Nagpur, right? That's where it begins.
It begins, but it quickly spreads. Quickly expands to all the major urban centers, and then it creeps into second, third tier cities and villages.
Did it ever have a presence in what we call today East and West Pakistan?
Yes.
It did.
It did. Indeed, it did. I don't have evidence whether it was in what we call Bangladesh today, actually, but definitely Pakistan, yes. So Lahore, Karachi, yes, absolutely. In fact, there was a real concern. There's a letter between Golwalker and Hedgewar in that period, where Golwalker's gone off to conduct a OTC, a officer training camp for the RSS in Lahore, and he talks Lahore. Somewhere there anyway. And basically he writes a letter to Hedgewar and he says, look, there's a group called the Kashkars who are formed all over here, Punjab and Sindh and that area. And basically the Kashkars are really similar to the RSS, except they're Muslim. And they don't want to see a Pakistan. The Kashkars did not want to see a Pakistan. The Kashkars wanted to see a unified Islamic India.
Who was their leader, the Kashkars?
The Kashkars, the name will escape me, it's in the book. But basically he was of the middle camp.
Okay.
He wanted to reform Islam.
But he wanted an Islamic India.
An Islamic India.
I see.
Yes. So he was kind of in that spectrum somewhere. Not quite as orthodox, but not quite as progressive, I would say. So the Kashkars wanted. Now the Kashkars then die out after partition very quickly because they got Pakistan, and a lot of Kashkars basically lost the spirit to say, well, forget the rest of India, we've got Pakistan now. Do you know what I mean? Like we've done it. Who cares? In fact, that was not what the founders of the Kashkars wanted. But in the 1930s, there was a concern that Golwalker writes to Hedgewar that look, we may end up clashing with these guys.
I see. Okay.
Because we're similar in methodology, but completely different ideologically. So these things are going on. So, and of course the British become concerned, right? The British, because the British know that they're retreating.
So Gandhi is concerned.
The British are concerned, and then these Kashgars are concerned.
Okay.
The clerics are really worried because remember now what's the bulwark against the clerical classes? It's this thing called the RSS suddenly that's popping up everywhere.
So what was the relationship between the RSS and the Congress, INC like? Apart from Gandhi, what other leaders were like interacting?
So my understanding is that Hedgewar was always open to the INC, very open. And I think on the whole, he saw the INC as a movement for good.
Okay.
On the whole.
Because
there are a lot of good people in it. He himself had spent 10 years in it. But he was deeply disenchanted with the leadership. Right?
Okay.
He was worried by Nehru's Soviet-style socialism. He was worried by Gandhian ideas of economics and Gandhian multiculturalism. He was very, very worried about these things. And he predicts in 1932 to his own people that if we keep going down this course, we will see the Balkanization of India. Not the partition, the Balkanization.
Okay. Wow, that's very forward thinking.
I mean, he was way beyond his contemporaries. I think out of all the national leaders of the time, I really feel that Hedgewar had the best grip on the geopolitics of the time. I think he knew the geopolitics and he was a seer that was far beyond his contemporaries, which is why he could see some of these ruptures happening, whereas the others couldn't.
I think Bose also had a lot of strategic foresight, let's say.
Yes, he did.
So, and was there any connection between the two?
Yes. So again, they never met. They tried to meet several occasions.
I see.
They never managed to meet, as far as I know. They never met. When Bose finally gets in front of Hedgewar, he's already dying. He's like on his deathbed, really. So they never spoke.
I see.
But a bit controversial. People won't like it. My contention, and from the evidence that I've seen, my conjecture, is that I think Hedgewar had some skepticism with Bose's solution.
Okay.
So look, both were nationalists. One is a cultural nationalist,
Yes.
Hedgewar, become a cultural nationalist. Bose was a political nationalist.
Yes.
But Hedgewar was concerned by Bose's methodology
I see.
and by Bose's post-independence. Remember, all these people knew the British were out. They were leaving. Matter of when, not if.
When, yes.
So, but he was concerned by Bose's rhetoric. So, for example, and look, now let me not say this in a moral sense. Let me say this in a more academic sense. Bose was your traditional fascist, right?
Okay.
He wanted a single-party state. He wanted to be at the helm of that state himself
right. Yes.
as a strongman dictator. In 1944, he even openly says that for 20 years we should have a dictatorship and we should build this country.
Yes.
Notice a political nationalist mind.
That's right.
So you capture the state, we'll re-engineer the society in our image, and everything will be good. Right? Fine. Right or wrong, good or bad, not my concern. But Hedgewar was concerned about that.
I see.
He didn't see that that's the way to form a society.
I see.
Because it wasn't in keeping with the tapestry of Indian life as far as he was concerned. And so at that time, between 1935 and 1940, by the way, look at what was going on to Hedgewar. You had Savarkar, who was, from the Hindu Mahasabha perspective,
Yes.
trying to co-opt the RSS. You had the INC and Gandhi, Nehru, trying to co-opt the RSS.
Okay.
You had Bose trying to co-opt the RSS. So you had all these major players of Indian history trying to co-opt the RSS for their own ends. And Hedgewar is constantly treading a thin line between all of them to say, I'm with you, but I'm not yours. I'm with you, but I'm not yours. Throughout. And therefore he does, in equal measure, hold the admiration of all of them and upsets all of them.
I see. What was did Hedgewar ever travel outside of India? I mean, we mentioned that he had a very American approach towards checks and balances. So did he have any?
No, as far as I can see, no, he didn't.
I see.
Maybe the furthest they got to is Karachi,
I see.
and up to Lahore, Karachi, that area, which he did go to.
Okay.
He also obviously went to Dhaka.
Okay.
When he was in Calcutta, he went across to that side with his secret societies at that time. So he got exposure to the subcontinent. Let's put it that way.
I see.
He got exposure. Didn't go over it, but he was an incredibly open mind, as far as I can see. So he was absorbing literature and news and ideas from the world over. So I wouldn't be surprised at all. I don't have any evidence, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if he was also looking at what's going on in the American experiment. I wouldn't be surprised.
And was there any communication or any meeting between Mr. Hedgewar, Dr. Hedgewar and Jinnah?
No.
There was
none.
Okay.
None that I can see.
What was his perspective towards the Muslim League and Jinnah?
Yeah. So again, these things worried him because remember, his entire intellectual edifice is that we are one people. There's one people here with one civilization, one cultural civilization. Your creed has changed. And Hedgewarian is a realist in the sense that your creed will change again. My creed will change again. Everybody's creed changes. Right? Every few hundred years, religions change. Religions come and go. Right? So that didn't bother him. But he saw the subcontinent as one integral unit, not just in land, but also in the people. So when the Muslim League comes along and starts propagating the two-nation theory, yeah, it concerns him, right? Because it's everything that he is against. It ruptures the very fabric of what it means to be Indian. I think history is proving the Hedgewarian mind right.
There's another opponent. There was another opponent of the two-nation theory. That was Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the Pashtun leader. And when partition eventually happened, he told Gandhi that you've thrown us to the wolves. So was there any connection between Dr. Hedgewar and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan?
So that particular name hasn't come up in my research.
I see.
But he certainly was. Even Munjay was in touch with many of these Muslim leaders who were not part of this clerical class. Remember, even Jinnah, right? Jinnah hated the mullahs.
He had a very interesting trajectory.
Yeah,
Jinnah. He was a nationalist.
He was a nationalist,
Yes.
right? And Jinnah was right to the end, by the way. He was very skeptical of the Deobandi clerics and his Beverly. He thought they were a dangerous bunch. But again, I'm not a Jinnah expert. I don't need to be. But something has certainly happened to him where he goes from resisting these clerics to suddenly co-opting them.
A sudden U-turn.
Sudden U-turn.
In the 1930s.
When he goes off to UK, comes back, and then
that period.
And then something changes.
Something changes.
Yes, correct. So there's something going on now. Maybe again, it's a great mystery for somebody to go and solve.
Oh, it is.
And I hope somebody does. But yes, and so these things are happening. So I think the moderate, progressive voice of the Muslim community gets lost during this period, and that's a shame and a tragedy for I think every Indian today, because you can just India has spent so much of its energy trying to grapple with its own identity, but on creed lines rather than Desh Bhakti. So from the Hedgewarian perspective, he would have liked to have seen Indians spend all this time consolidating on Desh Bhakti rather than on religious lines.
Indeed. What was Dr. Hedgewar's perspective on leadership and on politics? So he's got this organization that's a cultural nationalist organization. Did he believe in participating in politics?
No. He specifically said that allow the Rajya to be pursued by those who want the Rajya, i.e. the political nationalists. But the public, the society, which he felt was incapable, lacked capacity, etc., because of the history, had to be built up. So you first have to build a certain amount of capacity within the individual. You have to empower the individual to hold the Rajya to account. Right? And especially a democracy. Especially if India was to be a liberal democracy, then it had to have capable human beings.
That's right.
And he didn't see capable human beings around him.
That is true.
So he felt that the RSS should not categorically be involved in politics. That's why he kept the RSS away from the Hindu Mahasabha.
I see.
That's why he kept it away from the INC and so on and so forth. He said that the RSS would only do one thing and one thing only, which I think is now a clunky term called man-making, right?
Man-making.
but I think it's a clunky term. But basically it was a social capital. Let us just concentrate on building communities, on serving the community, on building civic organizations, right? Allow individual genius to go and solve these multifarious problems, right? But let the Shaka be the center point of cooperation, coordination, trust, right? That was it. And to this day, I think you still hear the Sir Sangchalak Mohan Bhagwat say things like, we only run shakhas.
Okay.
We don't do politics. You still hear all this.
Yes.
And I think it appeals back to that Hedgewarian mind that up until the Rashtra is strong enough to not just hold the Rajya to account, but can drive the Rajya, the RSS must continue doing its capacity building work. So I think to answer your question, no, I think he wanted it to stay away from politics directly.
I see. In political science, etc., there's something called the great man theory, that all change happens because of the actions of a few great men. Historically, it's been the case. So the philosophy that we see in the RSS seems to be very different. So what was the perspective, the approach towards leadership, towards developing leaders? I mean, it's clear that the leaders within the RSS seem to have very clear delimited boundaries as to where what their power can achieve. So what was the approach towards leadership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's a chapter in here called Leadership and Values.
Okay.
Which I hope will answer some of your questions. I think it's great. Let me just give a few overtures to it. One is, he was skeptical of power.
Okay.
He felt power would corrupt. I think many of us would agree with that. So he felt that you needed power, because if you wanted change, you had to have power, influence.
Yes.
But it can be corrosive to character. So you had to check that power. And so he was constantly obsessed, and I think the RSS today as well, unconsciously, because it's so ingrained, is obsessed with checking power.
I see.
So in the RSS of Hedgewar's time, you were basically given responsibilities, but your ability to influence was curtailed by your geography, by your territory. And every couple of years, people's roles would change.
I see.
You had to be moved. And you never paid respect to the individual. You paid respect to the position.
Military style.
Correct. Absolutely.
You salute the rank, not the man.
Exactly. And the RSS is, I think, still the same.
I see.
At least from the Hedgewarian perspective, it should be. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But certainly from the Hedgewarian perspective, he says these things in his Bodhics. So power diffused.
Okay.
Right? And power has to be decentralized.
Okay.
I.e., every shaka should be autonomous. There should not be anybody at the center doing a top-down, we are going to now do this.
Okay.
Right? It should very much be localism. Then the wisdom of the localism does creep up to the top of the chain, I suppose. But the chain doesn't drive instructions downwards.
Top down.
It's not a top-down approach. It's a bottom-up approach.
Okay.
Right? Or let's say it's a very symbiotic approach, right? So, for example, the Shaka Karyavar, he describes this. The Shaka Karyavar and all decisions have to be made in consensus.
Okay.
So that idea of the strongman theory, the ideologue at the center, the RSS dispels all of that.
Okay.
In fact, it's the exact opposite of all of that. Decisions have to get made in consensus.
Okay.
Then, even if you disagree with the decision, if you are a Swayamsevak, but once the consensus is made, you have to fall in line.
I see.
Again, very military.
Discipline.
Very disciplined, right? So many Swayamsevaks I find today will disagree with a lot of stuff that's going on, but they still do it.
Okay.
Because the consensus has been made.
I see.
Right? So, if consensually we've now decided to do X, as an individual, I feel X is not appropriate, but I will still do X now. Because us as a shaka, us as a unit, we move together. As a unit. Not the 70,000 units. They all move independently.
As one unit.
As one. Yeah. And so how do you then get this coordination between these autonomous cells? You have something called the Pracharak order.
Okay.
Now, this makes it unique because no other organization of the Hedgewarian time had anything like the Pracharak order. Not the INC, not the Kashgars, no one. So what the Pracharak order is, I mean, again, in popular discourse, they call them full-time volunteers, Abhijit. I mean, it's really unserving.
So what are they actually?
What they are is, you're good with history. the Pracharaks of today, and there's thousands of them in India, there's probably a Pracharak within 5 miles of this building.
Okay.
Right? They're everywhere.
Okay.
They dress like a normal commoner. They talk like a normal commoner. But these are men and women who have taken vows. And their vows are to fulfill the mission of the Rashtra, to build the Rashtra.
I see.
They give their lives to this mission.
I see.
They don't own anything. They have no money. They have no family. They don't marry. They don't have children. They live off the stipend that the Sangh or the Shakha would give them, right? And so they are akin to the medieval friars. If you're familiar with
That's
history,
what I was thinking of. Yes, it's an
they're
order.
akin to them. It's an order.
Yes.
It's an order where people take vows. They have a disciplined
So
way
they're
of
all
living.
celibate. They're all unmarried.
celibate. They're all, yeah, absolutely. Now, unlike the friars, unlike the monks, the friars lived amongst the people.
Indeed.
To serve the people. To
yes.
take the love of Christ into the public.
Yes.
Right? Not into
Only
the
friars
monasteries.
did.
Huh?
Only the friars did that.
Only the friars did that. The
Yes.
monks never did that.
The
The
monks
monks
did
stayed
not.
in their
They're
monastery.
cloistered.
They're cloistered,
That's right.
exactly. So these are the friars of the RSS. They go into the Samaj. They go into the society. They merge with the society.
I see.
They work within the slums. They work within the tribal areas. They work within the mountains, the forests, the urban centers, everywhere. And they mix with the local population. They start shakas. They help people train. They help people bring this Hedgewarian mind, Hedgewarian philosophy into the organization, right? But guess what? They have no power. They have no decision-making power. They can only influence. And the merit of their character gives them the credibility to hold any influence, right? So look at the checks and balances on power again.
And they don't get any publicity at all. No, they're
No.
anonymous.
Anonymous. They have to be anonymous. They have to remain in the shadows. They will give the credit to the Karyakartas, the Swayamsevaks. You take the credit, no problem. You know, the Pracharak will sit in the back. They should be sitting in the back. Now, sometimes power corrupts, but they should be sitting in the back. So that's why even today, thousands of men and women seamlessly work in the shadows. They work quietly, humbly. And I have met some of these people. They, honestly, if you look at them, you wouldn't even look at them twice.
I see.
Sometimes they hold no presence either. They have a demeanor that's very much like you'll just look over them.
Self-effacing.
But when you sit with them and you let them speak, suddenly you start realizing that these guys have a deep sadhana, a deep spiritual calling underneath what they're doing. And, and it's a tough ask, I think. I mean, I was speaking to a couple of people within the movement, the attrition rates in the Pracharak order are very high.
I see.
So young men and women want to become Pracharaks and Pracharikas. They, in the mid-20s or whatever, take on these vows. Most of them don't survive more than 5 years.
So
or
you're
6
allowed
years.
to drop out.
Yeah. Then you can drop, and that's again the Hedgewarian beauty of being fluid,
I see.
right?
That's
So
fantastic.
if it's compulsion you have, join. The moment you feel you want to get married, the moment you feel as if maybe this is not for you, no problem. Literally the next day, you can just become a Swayamsevak
I see. You transition seamlessly.
seamlessly.
I see.
And so there's a culture within the RSS where they've seen thousands of people be Pracharaks for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years.
I see.
And then they'll go and get married, have children, whatever.
And that's perfectly fine.
Perfectly
that's not
okay.
seen as something bad.
Yeah, but then they're not Pracharaks.
Okay. That's the only difference.
That's the only difference. They're not part of this order. So therefore now they leave the order, right? So it's in dress there's no difference. In talk there's no difference. But in action there's every difference. And so that's how the RSS continues to manage power and manage leadership and cultivate the kind of leadership that you're beginning to see in so many spheres. How is it, right, that Hedgewar creates an organization that apparently does nothing but build social capital, and yet today the RSS has the largest labor unions, the largest student unions. They've built something like 25,000 schools across India. They work in tribal areas. How was this done? This was done because Pracharaks and Pracharikas saw it upon themselves to build the Rashtra. They left their families and they went off into the jungles or into the cities or wherever they went and started building social capital there. The people that they built, the people that the Shakas built, then left the Shakas and continued. So, for example, a Swayamsevak might say, I see the water in my neighborhood is polluted and it really upsets me. Okay, you go and do something about it. So he starts creating a charity around water and water contamination. Right? Now, that's an independent organization. It's got nothing to do with the RSS. But because he's a Swayamsevak, because he was once a Karyakarta, and he knows the Pracharaks, that relationship, that social capital between the Pracharak and that Karyakarta, although politically, financially, operationally, totally independent, that relationship, that social capital makes that charity that's now to do with water part of the Sangh, part of the RSS.
So
isn't that powerful?
That's incredibly powerful.
Isn't it?
Indeed. So is this this model, the RSS model, applicable in your opinion to other countries, other cultures as well?
Absolutely.
Is it gaining prominence currently?
Well, this is why, one of the reasons why I was compelled to really spend so much of my life in understanding this man is because I could see that influence now creeping into Europe. I can see that influence creeping all over. And I think the world has become so globalized, right? And in this globalization, in this hyper-globalization, what happened was that with the advent of technology, internet, mass transit, mass mobilization, people became uprooted. People became uprooted from their soil. And so now Eric Fromm says it best, right? For a human being to have a flourishing life, a sense of rootedness needs to be there.
Indeed.
So this thing called rootedness is the Rashtra. That's what he was trying to build. That's what Hedgewar was trying to build. This rootedness in the Indian mind. Now, that rootedness has also, which was once very strong in the British, very strong in the French, very strong in the Americans, that's been shaken by globalization.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, the consequences of that shake-up of rootedness to the soil, what does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be English? What does it mean to be French? These questions are now being asked.
They are being asked.
And now, of course, you've got this regressive form of Islam across Europe, across the world,
I see.
right? As well. You've got these regressive ideas to do with masculinity rising up again, you know, through the internet. So again, you got a weird form of patriarchy and kind of forming up all over the place.
I see.
So again, these questions are bubbling up. Now I think the Hedgewarian approach will have something to contribute in the discussions within these countries too.
So is the Hedgewarian model and approach being noticed now outside of India? Among non-Indians?
I think it is at a very, very nascent stage.
I see. Okay.
And I think this book, I hope this book will help my friends, my society, right? I'm British. I live in London. UK is my home. It's probably where I'll die. I'm very, very British in that sense. And, you know, I'm concerned about some of the challenges that British society faces. And I think increasingly so, the British people will also be asking questions that Hedgewar asked in the 1920s. You know, now, 100 years later. So isn't it funny how history repeats itself, just in a different time and place?
Different context.
Yes. But I think the solution doesn't have to be the same, but I think there's a lot to be gained and gleaned from understanding this experiment. And so I hope this book aids in that dialogue, aids in that discussion, you know, and I hope people make up their own minds.
Now, you mentioned that Dr. Hedgewar was against participation in politics. So it is said that the BJP is the offshoot of the RSS. It's the political wing, let's say, of the RSS. How did that happen eventually? I'm sure it's after Dr. Hedgewar's time, but how did that end up happening?
Of course, it's way after the Hedgewarian times. But look, it's quite straightforward. So the BJP is a politically nationalist organization. BJP is not a culturally nationalist organization, right? It's there to take over the state through democratic means. It wants to take over the state, and then it wants to run using state power. It then wants to take the country in a particular direction. Good, bad, ugly for other people to decide, but that's what it does.
Yes.
That's raison d'etre. Okay, so that's the BJP. The RSS is not interested in state power. As I said, the RSS is interested in social capital, Rashtra, etc. Now, as people came out of the shakas, trained with this Hedgewarian worldview, saw that the Rajya is in problems. The Rajya is no longer serving the ambition, the Rashtra.
Yes.
In fact, it's the other way around. That the Rajya is trying to engineer the Rashtra. No, thank you. We will tell you, Mr. State, what you should be doing.
Okay.
You shouldn't be telling us what to do. Now, these individuals decided that, well, we better take over the state then. So they became political nationalists. So those Swayamsevaks, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, being a Pracharak, transitions out of cultural nationalism, moves into political nationalism, and he joins a party that was started by men of the RSS, who basically said, we want to capture the state in order so that it serves the Rashtra better.
Yes.
Okay. Whether it's doing that or not is for other people to decide. But that was the aim.
Okay.
So now, just like I mentioned about the charity, like, you know, a Karyakata can see that there is a lead poisoning in my river and I want to fix it.
Yes.
So I set up my own charity.
Yes.
Same way. These people saw the Rajya as a problem. I want to fix that Rajya. Okay, I'll set up a political party. Off they went. Now, what's the connection between... No. What ought be the connection between the RSS and the BJP? They should be operationally, financially, in every shape and form, independent. But the social capital between the Pracharaks and the BJP Karyakartas, the BJP cadre, because they are both of the Rashtra, but one is trying to capture the Rajya, they will have this relationship. So the Pracharaks will have this soft influence. So the RSS will have a soft influence on the BJP.
Not the BJP.
But not a direct... Again, it's not like how popular imagination and academia...
High command thing. Yeah.
I mean, this is all just... I think it's tropes that don't serve the purpose. And my point is this. Even if you dislike the RSS, suppose you think the Hedgewarian mind is nefarious. Suppose you think the RSS is a malevolent organization.
Okay.
Right? Let's suppose you think that's okay. Having these inaccurate tropes about the RSS will not help you. You need to get accurate. You need to get real with the RSS in order for you to even deal with the malevolence. If you think it's a malevolent force, you still have to engage with the Pracharaks. You still have to engage with these shakas. Right? So my argument in this book is it took an outsider to come in and do this kind of work for a little while. But I think this is what everybody in India needs to be doing. They need to grapple with the RSS. They need to ask the questions you've been asking, and rightly so. And it's regardless of whether you think it's a good force or a bad force. Because it is shaping the Rajya. It is shaping the Rashtra. It is shaping every nook and cranny of this country. And so, you know, let's get real about it. Let's not create tropes that they may have served some shallow end purpose long ago. I don't see the RSS as a hierarchical organization. I don't see it as a Brahmanical organization. I see it as a casteless, creedless, classless society that they're trying to build in the Rashtra.
Okay.
But of course, you know, we don't live in utopias, so I'm sure there's lots of greys and all the rest of it.
So, what were Dr. Hedgewar's later years like? How long did he live? I believe he never married, right?
He never married. I would say he was the first Pracharak, right? In that sense, he set up this tradition. He died in 1940.
1940.
Yes.
I see.
So he was only alive for 15 years of his own experiment.
I see.
Yeah. The last 6-7 years of his life were pretty much in bad health.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was in poor health.
I see.
Mainly due to the lifestyle. And his 1 year in prison and his second term in prison as well, both times in prison, did him bad.
I see.
Yeah. And so he was in bad health. And he died at the age of 51.
Okay. That's pretty young.
Very young.
Yes.
Very young. In those last phases of his life, 3 things concerned him. One, he could see the rupture coming in Indian society, or the balkanization of India, as he said it. Number 2 was his succession.
Yes.
Because he knew the organization was young. It wasn't secure in that sense. And there were lots of these powerful forces from the Hindu Mahasabha to the INC to the to Bose, who were trying to co-opt it. And he didn't want it to be co-opted. So how will he safeguard the organization after his death? So that was on his mind. And then the third thing was the emancipation of women.
Okay.
I think he was very adamant that gets to a certain maturity while he's still around. Because 1936 it starts, by 1940 he's died. So maybe, he didn't have much time on that. But look, I don't romanticize him. I think he had a really, really tragic early life and quite a sad end of his life.
I see.
But what is quite interesting about this man is that he becomes what the psychologist Sam Altram calls the devoted actor, where basically here is a man whose philosophical ideas, wherever they came from, philosophical ideas, become so front and center of his personality that they hijack and they overtake his entire being. And so what Sam Altran calls the devoted actor. So Hedgewar becomes the devoted actor. So the gap between what he says, what he believes, and what he does have just fused. And so while from the outside it looks like quite a tragic, sad life, and a difficult life, by the way, very, very hard life, for him, I suspect it was incredibly enriching, rewarding, and some degree satisfying, even though he would have died very concerned for India's future.
What do you see his legacy as? I think it's still in progress, right? It's a work in progress. The kind of impact he's going to have on the world. I think it may just be beginning perhaps.
And I think, Abhijit, that's one of my motivations for writing this book, is that I really feel that whereas the Gandhian century is ending and his influence is waning, the Nehruvian model has failed.
Yes.
Bose never took off.
He did not.
Even, I would say, the Ambedkarite project, as noble as it was, I don't see where that's going. Savarkar, I don't see where that's going either. I think the Hedgewarian ideas, the Hedgewarian story, is not just matured. I think it's maturing, and I think it's going to carry on in a much more significant way, going to shape the next 100 years of Indian society and the geopolitics of our planet. Now, whether it's for better or worse, I don't know. But I think everybody needs to understand the RSS.
So he started the organization with a certain set of aims in mind to improve the condition of Indian society and so much more. When do you think, in his opinion, you'll feel that his work is done?
Oh, really interesting. Yes, that's a good question, isn't it? So look, I don't know, but there's a conjecture in the book. But basically, from the Hedgewarian perspective, there is this utopian ideal.
End state.
End state. There is an end state. Where, and by the way, the RSS guys say this particular bit in a very bad way. It gets misinterpreted.
I see.
So the RSS guys in today, modern speak, say things like the Sangh, the RSS Sangh, will become the Samaj, or the Samaj will become the Sangh.
Okay.
And they'll say things like, everybody is a Swayamsevak, or everybody will be a Swayamsevak.
I see.
Now, this kind of stuff sounds authoritarian.
Okay.
It sounds malevolent. It sounds quite dark, actually. And Christoph Jeffrelo writes about this
I see.
a lot.
Uh-huh.
And he's taken it from the RSS literature.
I see.
Right?
I see.
And when you read it at that level, I agree with Christoph. Right? Like, it is dark. Right? When you say things like, we will take over the society.
It's not worded properly.
It's not worded properly. It's very bad. Very bad. The Hedgewarian mind, the end game, is that there is no need for the RSS. The RSS dissolves because a Rashtra has been formed which is built on Desh Bhakti, and it has the whereabouts to encompass the entire richness and tapestry of the Indian society, including Muslims, Christians, atheists, and everybody else, right? Including tribals, including our environment and our fauna and our
flora, fauna,
everything.
all of it.
So there is this utopian endgame, but it's at that point the very need for building social capital in this way will dissolve. And he says basically the Pracharak order itself will just dissolve. It just won't be necessary. It won't be required.
Okay.
So there is this, and of course, they a lot of people have spent time. I don't talk much about it because it's not beyond the scope of the book. But basically, they talk about, say, well, how would we know when there is a Rashtra formed? What are the telltale signs of a Rashtra? How do we know when the Rashtra is formed? Because it takes hundreds of years. So they have certain KPIs, if you can call it that.
Okay, yeah.
So one is things like peaceful. How peaceful and harmonious is a society?
Yes.
So literally measuring conflict between communities.
You can put a number on that.
Put a number on that.
Yes.
Right. Then things like women's emancipation. Right. They look at that. Then things like the environment, right? Here in this country, everybody's obsessed with this whole cow vigilante stuff and protecting the cow and all this. From the Hedgewarian perspective, my conjecture is that it's about protecting all animals.
Okay.
So if the RSS is starting with protecting the cow today, I don't think anybody should be naive enough to think they'll stop there. They'll then move to all other animals.
It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is it will upset a lot of those people who have vested interests in exploiting animals. So the RSS is not going to be your friend, right? Because the Hedgewarian mind is that we have to have a Rashtra that is embedded in its natural environment.
Sounds like a really fascinating book, and I look forward to reading it. What's next for you after this?
Oh gosh, I am intellectually quite exhausted. I don't know is the answer, Abhijit, if I'm honest. I've resigned and I've retired from my private equity life. I now run a small NGO called the International Center for Sustainability.
What does it do?
We basically look to nudge public and government policy and corporate policy in Delhi, London and Washington.
Okay.
And our job is to work in that corridor. And my argument is that I think India is too big, too significant for only Indians to worry about.
Okay.
All of us need to be involved in developing and helping India rise in the right way as a really prominent player within the global community. And I want to nudge the policies in a way that are environmentally friendly. They are, again, in that sense, globalized, and we build a sustainable, flourishing societies. So that's now what I dedicate my time to. And so I'm based out of London, and this is what I do. So, what next in terms of literature? I don't know. We shall see. But I've got a few ideas.
Okay. Well, I look forward to the next installment of whatever comes after this.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Lovely speaking to you.
Thank you.